So in the last video we created this login screen in WPF, and we got to the stage where we need to fix this password field. So right now it's just a text field so you can see the password you're typing. So we want to change this to a password field. So we click the password here. Let's start by just changing this to a password box. And then let's run and see what happens now. And we styled the text box. So obviously the password box now is a password box, but there's no style. So the password box very similar. So all we need to do is open the text style, which was this one here, and just go ahead and copy and paste. Because it's so similar, I already know the template's basically the same. Change the type to password box, and then control click to select, control C to copy, and then change the type here as well in the control template. And that'll change the template styling to match, and that should be all we need now. So if we run again, we should now have a password box all styled. And you can see now we've got a password box that's styled the same. The only difference is now we're missing this placeholder text. And this gets a little bit tricky now because WPF by nature almost forces view model behavior, MVVM. And that means that really the UI should only ever bind to properties, and it should listen for events, and it should act in that way. So there shouldn't be any code behind in your class. If there is, there should be very little. So the issue we've got here, so if we take a look at the style, the way we did the style is, scroll down, we had a data trigger and we bound it to the text property of the text box, and when that changed to a value of blank, we made the placeholder visible. Now the issue with the password field, so let's just jump to a class somewhere. So if we look at the text box first, and we were binding to the text. Now we weren't binding to text as you think we were actually binding to text property, but you can't see that. So we just type text and then press F12. This will take us to the actual control. And you can see text is just a string, but in WPF when we've done the binding to string, it's actually bound to this thing here, text property, which is a dependency property. And you can think of that just like a view model, I notify property changed. And in fact, if we step into that, you can see even though it doesn't inherit that, it's in the Windows base, which is the WPF specific assembly. It's actually got functions that are similar to property changed. So you've got like your events. We scroll. Well, anyway, you can think of this class. There's no point in going into depth with this class, but think of it when you bind into a dependency property as the same as binding to a view model. When the text gets changed, you get an event fired back to the UI that then fires off all the events in the UI. If we then go to the password box, and we do, for one, you've got no text. You've now got what's called password. But that won't matter. If we bound to password, if we take a look at password, then you can see there's no dependency property for password. So there's actually a rooted event for the password changed, but there's no event for the password text changing. So we might be able to bind to this rooted event, but then we want to bind to the text changing and whether there's a password in there or not. So it still wouldn't really help us because password changed rooted event. If we go to the rooted event, it's just the name, and then we can't check the property, so we still don't know when the password is changed whether it's got text or not. It's not exactly the same. So it's now an instance where we need to add some ability to a UI element in order for it to style correctly. So the next thing I would have done is gone, right, let's just subclass the password box. So you'd make a new class, my password box, and then you try and subclass password box, and then you'll see now it's complaining, and you can't derive from it because it's sealed. So sealed, instead of it being public or private, or well, rather sealed is different than the accessor. So sealed means you can no longer subclass. You can't then inherit from this password box. So now we can't add any ability to make a new control from a password box. So then the only other option from there would then be to make a new control that then inside has a password box. And then when you do that, you actually lose a lot of functionality in terms of it still being a password box, and it becomes a real big rabbit hole that you go down. So with that eliminated, the last step, which would actually break MVVM and view models, is that you could say, okay, then I'm just going to listen out to the password changed event. And then in the code behind, which is this is where you want to stay away from as much as possible, you could then say, well, I've now got the sender, which is a password box. And you can then access the secure password, or you can access the password, either way. And you could do like the length. And then if the length is greater than 0, we could then try and find from the password in the code behind, go into this template, find by templated name this placeholder, then set the visibility. But what you're falling back into there is the old Windows Forms style of doing UI coding. You're then making your code very specific. Your logic for that is very heavily tied to being in this UI itself, which means that when you went to a different UI, that this placeholder being shown and hidden based on that fact would be totally different. You'd have custom logic. There's many reasons why you don't want to be doing that. We want to just bind, just the same as we've done here. We want to bind to some property, so an iNotify change property, like a view model property, or a dependency property. They're really the two things we need to do. So when you've got no other option to do anything without breaking MVVM, and I think this is why Microsoft probably made attached properties in the first place, is you have to fall back to something called an attached property. And it's basically a dependency property, so like text is, but it's an arbitrary one that you can attach to any element. So we can attach it to the password box. And you've actually seen this in grids. So we're in a grid here, and you see inside the scroll viewer, we can do grid.column, and we can set a property that's effectively associated with a grid on an element that isn't a grid. And this is an example of an attached property. So it allows us to specify extra pieces of information we need on UI elements to enhance the UI functionality. That's all the purpose should be for. The only time you should use an attached property is when you can't do something in UI and you can't do it any other way. And that's my personal stance on when to use attached properties. So we're now going to use it to fix this visibility issue. So what we need is a property, and we're going to call it, say, has text, because we don't care about what the password is. We just, if we've got a password, we want to hide the placeholder, otherwise we want to show it. So we're going to call it has text, and then this will just change to has text. So first, let's just make a folder and call it attached properties. And then let's make one called password box properties for now. And then in here, we will now create an attached property. And this I really don't like. I think we'll have to fix this, but you watch what happens when we create an attached property. So we just want one called has text. So we want the property called has text. So it needs to be a dependency property. Oops. Bit slow there. Right, dependency property. It's going to be called has text. Now the first quirk, this is the name we want, has text. So to make an attached property, you have to put the word property after it, and that's how WPF finds it. That's now going to be a new, oh no, sorry, not a new, it's going to be a dependency property, and then we want to do this register attached function, and this effectively registers it with WPF. Then you have to manually type has text. So that's the second time we've now written has text. We've written it here, then we've written it here, but with property at the end. we need to tell it what type it is, instead of just defining a variable as you normally would. We want it to be a Boolean. And on top of that, we also have to tell it who the owner is. So where, you know, what its parent is, which is again a type of, and then you have to pass in the class that it's in. So you can see already this is getting messy. And then finally we have metadata, which I believe is the default value of this property, effectively of the Boolean property, if you will. And then we have to make that inside of a new property metadata and pass false. And that's not even the end of it. So already look how messy this is. Just to make what should really be a public Boolean has text get set equals false. That's what we want to do. That's all you should have to do. Instead, you have to do dependency property has text property, and then it equals a dependency property register, then has text in text, then the type in a type of, then the owner in this, and then a new metadata, and then the false. And that is just to register. That still won't work. Now we have to make the getter and setter. We have to make this and this. And again, they just follow naming conventions. So you have to do, this can be private actually. Private static void set has text. So now again, this is the third time we've typed has text. And now we put the word set in front of it. And then inside there, we want the password box, and that's the element. And then you make a function, and then you do the element dot set value. So now we're setting the value of the inside the password box. This is where we're attaching the property. So you set the element, and then you want to pass it the has text property. So this is where you're attaching that property. And then we want to set the value true or false to whether the password box's secure password length is greater than 0. So if it has any text, then the has text becomes true. And then as well as that, we have to now do we'll do a public, because we want to be able to access this in the UI, in the template, and it's a Boolean, and it's called get has text. And you can see where I'm going with this. It's now the fourth time we've typed this text word. So we've done it here, we've done it here, we've done it here, we've done it here. It's getting really, it's actually hard to type because I cannot stand repetitive code and overcomplicated things, and this is such a messy design by Windows. So the get, we now need to just do we need to cast it. We need to do the element.getValue. So from the password box, get the value of the has text property. We also have to return that, obviously. And there you go. All that is to do effectively this, but in a way that WPF understands as a, you know, so you can attach this. So now we could attach this property to the password box. But the thing is, we need to also listen out for the password box. So we need another attached property. And this is where the danger of having things where you go multiple times. If I accidentally mistype something there, it'll still compile and work. Well, not work, it'll compile and it'll think it's worked, but it won't really work because when you try to attach to it, it won't find the other names. Same as here, you can mistype anything in all of them, and every single one will compile. You can now compile that. Obviously, other than this part, these have to match here. But this doesn't have to, this doesn't have to, this doesn't have to. So that alone is dangerous, to be able to type something that will compile and have an issue. Anyway, moving on. That's the has text property. That's a lot of code just for that. Copy and paste all of it. Just want to be slightly lazy. And now I'll carefully rename these. We need now we need to monitor that password changed event in order to then set this has text. So we'll call it, I guess, monitor password. We'll then copy this to here. The type is going to be, well, it doesn't matter what the type is actually. It can stay as a Boolean because we're not going to use it for that. Then we change this text here. we change this here, and set to, let me think this through a minute, we need the actual value. So we'll just pass in a Boolean here, because really we're using this as sort of a way to actually hook into the password. So when we add this attached property to the password box, as you'll see, we simply use this set monitor password event to then say, right, let's go ahead and actually hook in and start listening out for the password changed. So let's just finish this off. It'll make sense in a minute. I've got it in my head, but you'll see where it's going in a moment. And then you want to get the property. So again, it's just return the property. So these are just just basic getter and setters like we've done here. The only difference is we've passed in a value here. This will need to be public because the setter needs to be accessed in code. So there's your getter and setter. Separate it a bit from here for now. I'm not commenting this, by the way, because I don't plan to keep this. I've got to redesign this in some way. I just want to show you the standard off-the-shelf way of doing attached properties. So we can now attach this monitor password property to our style, but we also need to listen out for when it changes so that we can do the hook in and actually listen out for the password change. So in this property metadata, as well as the default value, you can pass in a callback. So for that callback, we'll call it on monitor password changed, and we'll create that, which I just did control and dot on that, and it gave me an option to generate. It's now generated this event, so this should get fired whenever we attach a property. So let's just put a breakpoint there. So now to use this monitor password, and this has text, if we go back to the style of the password box, in here we can set the property, and this is the same as doing, we could set it in here and just do local colon password box properties dot monitor password is true. So we can do it there and that'll work. It's just that the compiler's complaining, but that will work fine. But we want to do that in style, so in fact we can just take that, because we want this on all password boxes by default. We want to set this monitor and we want it to be true. So now this password box should call, it'll attach this property, and when this property changes here, it'll call this. So if we run this now, if everything compiles and I've written that right, we should effectively hit this function because we attach the property, and there you go, we see. So now we've got access to the password box here in the dependency object. So now this is almost like the constructor, if you will, you can think of it, because we've attached the property here. So we've set this attached property on the password box. All we've used that for is to fire off this event changed of the fact that this is on. So inside this monitor password, first we want to get the password box, which you saw was there. Well, in fact, let's do a as, so it won't crash the application if it's not. And then if we didn't have one, there's nothing more we can do. Again, no comments because I'm going to remove all this shortly. So now the password box, we want to say remove any previous event, and we need to make that event. Let's just comment that out a moment. Then if we are attaching, so if the value they set monitor here to true, then we want to hook into the password changed. So that's in the events new value. So this event new value is this value we passed in. If that's a new value, we want to hook into the password box. So password box password change plus equals, press tab twice and then just enter to give it that name, and this has created the callback for us. So now every time the password changes, this will get fired. So let's just run that again. Let's do it step by step. So we hit here, we get the password box, which is something. The new value is true, what we passed in, so then we hook into the password changed. So now if we type, we then hit this password change. So now we've got a password changed event. So we can now use this event to set this has text property, and then we can hook into that has text property in the UI as the thing that we want to hide or show the data. So because here we've hooked into the event, each time this value changes, by default, let's just remove that event as well. Otherwise, if you just keep adding, you're going to end up with 2 events, then 3 events, then 4 events. So this cleans up the previous event, and then if we wanted to add, we then add the event. Every time we change the monitor password, we want to set this has text property back to false by default, or back to whatever the value should be. So we just want to call this set has text on the password box initially, so it actually has the correct value at the start before anyone types anything. So to do that, call has text property, set has text, and pass in the password box. So that sets up the default, and that's really it. That's now gonna, when you type in monitor password on your property here, that's gonna hook in, listen out for password changes, and then it's gonna set the has text value there. And then we also want to, every time the password actually changes, then we want to call it set has text again, and the sender is the password box. So we're just doing the same as this. Every time it changes, we update the has text property. So now the password box will have, similar to this, it will have this property, but it will have has text as the property. So all we need to do now is in this binding here, instead of binding to text, we want to bind to password box properties dot has text. But when you bind into an attached property, again, another little quirk in WPF is you have to wrap it inside of parentheses, and that prevents, it's just the way that WPF resolves attached properties. This is sort of lets it know it's an attached property. We've got the data trigger has text. When it's visible, we want it to be visible when there is no text, so we have to change this value to false. And I think that's it. So let's run this. I sense a crash coming on. No, just something really slow. Oh, we've got a breakpoint. Let's remove that breakpoint. There we go. So you can see password, and we type, hopefully. There we go. So we've now added the same function as the text box using an attached property. And this is how we've done it. And it's, again, it looks very messy. So this is just to make one property. And you're using all these, you're typing this 4 or 5 times, and you're defining things in strange ways. When in reality, all you want to do, and all you should have to do, is do something similar to this. Just, public Boolean has text, getter and setter, and then set the default value. You want it to be as close to normal as you can. So that's done, and that works, and that gives you a brief overview of attached properties. And again, the only time you want to use them is when you're trying to enhance UI functionality, and that's the only time you should use them. So we're trying to enhance the way this UI works to show this placeholder, and you can't subclass, and you can't do any other way around getting that UI to happen. Then attached properties are your fallback, and it just lets you add, as you've seen in here, to basically add a property, and then do things like when it changes, you can then access that UI element and then hook manually into events, similar to the way you'd work in Windows Forms. But then when the events finish and do what they want, you then jump back to setting dependency properties, or doing something in a a UI manner. So it might be a little hard to understand why to use them at this stage, and they look very confusing, but hopefully you get the gist of what they're doing. And the best example is, like I say, the grid. So the grid contains multiple items, and this is one of them. And you've seen the grids in other examples, like the window. Where's the window? Main window. And we did this grid, and we had that's a bad example, keep going. So here's a grid with column definitions. So we want the header here, this column to be there, this column to be there. So then these elements that are anywhere in the grid have this grid.column specified, so that then it can lay out specifically, but this has no interpretation of what a grid is. It doesn't understand anything, but yet you need to tell it what column it's in. So this is like a prime example of where attached properties are useful, so that the grid itself, the parent, can say, well, of all of my children, what is the column value attached to that element? So it's a way to, you know, store information on elements in UI that the actual element you're attaching it to has no idea about, you know, this value, doesn't know what to do with it, and you add that logic yourself. So that's all done. That's sort of the point of the tutorial, but I can't stand this. We need to clean this up. There's no way we want to do this, and so we make 50 properties, attached properties. There's no way you want to retype this all the time. Then you want to rename this. Oh, let's rename has text. Okay, we'll name it to had text. Alright, so that's done once, but now we've got to rename it here. So now you've got to do rename had text. And now you've got to do it here. So rename get to had text. And now we've got to do it here. So you've got to rename it 4 times every time you want to just change the name of a property. And you've also got to type it that many times. And you've got to type all this, and you've got to remember all this. It's an absolute nightmare. So let's start by deleting this. I can just go. We're not going to do that. So you've seen what we needed to do there. We needed to create 3 different things. We now need sort of a base for this. So let's call this base. Oh, let's call it base attached property. Let's get rid of all the unused stuff. And this is going to be a public abstract class. And I believe I've done a video on generics. I'll have to check. I won't go too much into generics right now. I'll do a separate video on them after. But you can make generics. It's a way of passing in unknown information into a class, or partially unknown information. So in this instance, it's a base attached property, but we need to know something about the parent, which is going to be our attached properties that we make, and we need to do things with those parents, and if you will, the parent class of this class. So it's sort of a way of handling that. So we do this angle brackets to do that, and then inside here we can do, say, the letter T, and that's now this unknown element, which is just a type of property. And then if we wanted to make a subclass of that, we can do my attached property, and that's of type base attached property, open, and we'll pass in, say, a Boolean, not a cool, a Boolean. Helps if you type the word class. And now my attached property is of this type base attached property, and it's actually of this type Boolean, we've decided. But now what you can do is jump back to the base class, and you could say do a public void, or let's say a public string, what's my type? And this could return type of t dot to string, say. And now every class that inherits this base attached property, like this my attached property, if we then make another class, just CTOR is missing in 2017. Okay. And then we do, say, make a new attached property. You can see M has now got what's my type. and this would return, the type would be either my attached property or base attached property Boolean, whichever this returns, I'm not sure. But the point of this is you can have a base class that can do things for the parent class of various types. Again, so I'll do a specific video on generics, but that's what we're doing. The reason for passing in an unknown is so that we can do things with the parent, and then the parent can simply inherit from it and get the added benefits. So it'll become more apparent now. Let's give this a description. So a base attached property. We've placed the vanilla WPF attached property, and then this is going to be, in fact we won't call it T because you can call it anything, we'll call it parent. So the parent class to be the attached property, and we also then need the property itself. So obviously we're going to now have a class for the property, so has text is going to be the class, and it needs to be a certain type like Boolean, so we need a type, so we'll call this property. Add the description there. The type of this attached property. We'll need an instance of the parent in order to access and call functions on it. So we'll make that public. And we'll need an instance because, as you saw with the other attached properties, everything was static. So the set value was static, the get value was static, the property itself was static, whereas we're creating a class that's not static. So we need a way to access the class itself, and this is through a singleton. So it's just a single instance that will always be this type, or the type of the parent in this case. So static, and then now you could specify the type here like Boolean. We're going to specify this unknown type, which is parent. So it's a public static variable of type parent, which we don't know of. We know nothing about it, but we can create an instance of this parent, and this is where generics really comes in handy. So there's the instance. You want a getter with a private setter because we're the only ones that want to set it. We want to make it a new parent, so a new version of our parent class. To do that, because we know nothing about this, we don't even know whether you can create a new instance. It could be an enum, and you can't create new enums. So we need to tell this subclass, this base class rather, that at least that where parent colon new, and that's a way to define some information. It looks a bit similar to SQL, and this tells the base attached property that the parent can at least be newed. It's something that you can create a new instance of, so it's an object. So now we can create this new instance of a parent. So any property that enhances from this, its subclass is the base attached property. We've got an instance of itself in the static domain, if you will. So this is a singleton instance of our parent class. And again, don't worry too much about understanding this. This is quite far advanced. This is something I just do naturally, but I can tell you now this is quite a complicated thing I'm doing. I'm trying to explain it, but it might be sort of 40 videos in future where you fully understand what I'm doing. But I'm going to explain it anyway, and you'll see the end result, and you'll understand the benefits of the end result. It just means you don't have to write the attach properties in a nasty way. You can just use this class and make them really easy, and that's good enough for, you know, now. You don't always have to fully understand the code in order to use it, so long as you have, you know, an idea of what it's doing. So don't worry too much. I don't expect many of you to grasp, in fact almost all of you I don't think will grasp it, exactly what's going on right now, but it's good to see some, you know, really advanced code, if you will. It's simple yet advanced. It's going to be a very small class, but there's a lot of complicated things going on. So now we've got that property. We need to jump back and do the actual attached property definitions, if you will. We still need to make an attached property somewhere, so we're going to have to do the get value, set value, and value property things. So I could have kept the old file and copy and pasted, but I guess I'll have to retype it now. So now we're just going to redo what we've already just done, which is make the standard dependency property. So that was dependency property, and this is just what we've done before I deleted the code file. We're going to call this value because it's a singleton. Well, it's not a singleton, rather it's a base property, so each class is just going to have .value, which is the attached property. So we're going to attach to a value. So instead of it being has text property, which it was before, because this is a generic class and can be any, we're just going to call it value property. We're going to do the dependency property.register attached again. One name we'll call value, so we're going to have to retype value 4 or 5 times, but that's the only time we're going to have to do it. After that, it's been done for us. Now the type before was property type. It's the type of the property we pass in, so if we pass in a Boolean, then it'll be a Boolean. Now we need the owner, so the owner is going to be a base attached. It's going to be attached. Well, effectively, it's this. We're going to attach it to ourselves. We are the parent. So a type of, and then this class. And then we want the new property metadata. We want. We don't care about a default value. We just want to get this callback done. So let's make a new property changed callback, and then inside that it finally needs a function. So we'll call this on value property changed, because we'll need this to do the monitor text thing. We'll generate that with control dot and finish that. So this is the actual attached property. The attached property for this class, and this is the callback event when the value property is changed. We won't bother about. Well, this is the UI element that was changed, that had its property changed. Arguments for the event. In this property changed, well, I think we'll come back to this last. Let's just move on to the other 2 functions we have to do, which were public static, and then this time we want to return the property, whatever that is, again, because this is going to be passed in. So this is like where we did the get and set. So this will be the get value, and we need the dependency object passing in, and that's it. And now instead of doing, when you've got like single line of functions like this, and you're going to do return the property of the element, get value of value property, I think that's right. So when you got one liners like this as a function, if it's returning a value, simply remove the return, and then either way, if not, if it's a an action doing a single line, then it's already a single line like that. Just delete the curly brackets, put a space equals greater than, delete the other curly bracket, and then there you go. It's sort of defined similar to a lambda expression. So greater than equals, and then the single line that we want to do, in this case get the value, and that's still a function, still a method, but it's declared in a single line. It looks a bit cleaner and shorter. So that's still just a, it's still a function. So it's a function that returns a property, and then this is the property that it gets. There's just no word return here, and there's no curly brackets. So that's all that's doing. That's making that even smaller. So this gets the attached property. and then this is the element to get the property from. Now we need the setter, so it'll be void set value dependency object, and then it's going to be property value, and then again we'll do the one-liner, and we'll just do d.setValue value property and the value. Sets the attached property, and then this is the same. The value to set to. So that's the conventional attached property thing we had to do for every class. So we're doing it here, but passing in, using the generics to pass in, you know, the type of property where we want. We got the onValue property changed. We now need to add events so that we can actually listen in, so that, you know, the callers can listen in on the properties changing and things like that. So we've got an instance there. So we want an rather event. So we want public events. This wants to be a public event. It's an action. It's going to return a. Rather, it's not going to return. It's going to pass in the object. I didn't press Shift 5 times. It's going to pass in the dependency object, which is the sender, like the password box. It's also going to pass in the events, which will contain the value. So the property, dependency property changed event args. So that's the type of event. It's going to give us the sender and the arguments, because that's what it does here. And we'll call this value changed. We'll make it a new blank method, well, event, with the sender and the args. Get this right in a minute. There we go. Fired when the value changes. So that's just an event we can fire. So then in the property changed, we want to fire that event. But we want to, you can notice this is not static. This is again on each class that we make, so that, you know, things can hook into that event. So we want to do call event listeners, which will be instance.value changed. Oh yeah, we also need to tell the base attached property to the parent, because the parent's always going to be of this type. We're just passing the parent in, so we know effectively the parent's always going to be it's going to be the same type. It's going to be this type. So we can do a little trick here in the where, and tell ourselves that the parent is always ourselves, if that makes sense. It's always going to basically subclassing this class, so we know, at least we know that the parent is going to be of this exact type of whatever we pass in. So now the instance, we can access any non-static information that's in the base class as well. Again, probably over everybody's heads, but I'm going to explain it anyway. Value change, let's pass in the same information we had. We're just passing it up to the parent now. And then as well as the listeners, we want the parent to just be able to override an event. Like, we want to really override this, but we can't because it's static. So as well as having a property changed event, we want to be able to do something when the value changes, like a virtual function. So as well as the public events, we want a event methods, and this is going to be a public and virtual, because this is an abstract class, so it doesn't have to implement. So we're just going to say virtual void, well, actually we don't need to put abstract here, virtual's fine, it just means it can be overridden. Call it on value changed. Again, we want the dependency object, which is the sender, and the dependency object's arguments as E, and we just want it to be nothing for this one. The method that is called when the value, when any attached property of this type is changed. The UI element that this property is changed for, and the arguments for this event. And then in this on property change, we also want to fire effectively the parent. This will be the parent function if they override it. So call the parent function. Again, you'll see this in use in a moment. It'll be the instance dot on value changed. Pass in the information again. And I think that's it. We've got all those functions, we've got the value event, we've got the getter, the setter, and that's it. So it's a small class, it's 82 lines, get rid of the surplus space, it's 81 including the end line. So again, don't worry too much about fully understanding that. If you did, that's great. If not, I hope that this will become understood fully as videos go on and I explain generics in more depth and these things in more depth, and you know, I'll go a lot more in depth, but hopefully now that's an attached property base. We can now just add another class and let's re-implement the attached properties we want. So password box attached properties. Give it whatever name you want. Just delete that class, we don't need that now. So now to make an attached property, if this works and if I've thought it through right, let's start with the has text property. So we want a public class has text property, wants to implement the base value converter. That's not what we called it. The base attached property. Where's the base? I didn't call it value converter, did I? No, base attached property. It's the base attached property of, okay, we just slow it in IntelliSense updating. So it's always going to be itself, its parent, so it's this, and we want it to be a Boolean. And that's it. Voila, there's an attached property, one line. And all we have to do is specify effectively ourselves. So if we rename this, it will rename both instances, so we don't have to worry about retyping things. And we've told it what type the attached property is. Now let's make the has text attached property for a password box. And that's just not going to find that because it's in a different namespace. 1 second, I'm just finding the namespace. Being lazy again. There we go. So that has text attached property for the password box. And now we want the, what did we call it before? Monitor password, I think we called it. Public class monitor password property. It's a base attached property. It's of its own type. Monitor password property, and again it's a Boolean. And that's it. We've just recreated the two attached properties with one line. Give this the right name. And then now we also need to, if you remember rightly, when this property changed, we hooked into the password changed. Well, that was the reason I made this event method here, so we can override on value changed, which was originally passed in this value dependency property at the very end, was passed in here. But because dependency properties have to be static, then when we're creating a new class, you can't access the static members, you can't override them. So the reason I did that was so now you can just do override on value changed. And that's it. So now we've all got access to when the value changes. And we don't need to call the base because it does nothing. So now when the property changed, we want to get the password, basically exactly the same code as we did just in the previous one. It's the sender as password box. See if I can remember what I typed. I think it was a password box as null return. Let's comment this. Get the caller. Make sure it is a password box. If it is, then we want to remove the previous event handler, which we haven't got yet. We'll come back to that in 2 seconds. And then if, I think it was Boolean of the event new value, so if they actually passed in true, then we want to first we want to call or hook into the password changed event, plus equals tab twice, and that'll give us the event. And then we can now step back up a moment. Let's remove that there. Remove any previous events. If the caller set monitor password to true, start listening out. Start listening out for password change. Jeez. Then when it changes, we just did we do? We just set the property. Oh yeah, we also set it here. So set default value, which is the has property, which is here. So you want to do the has text property dot set value, because we included those helper functions. It's going to be the password box itself. And now you see we want to pass the value. In the previous one we had a set value that didn't accept a value because we wanted to work it out based on the password box. So we could do it here and just say password box dot secure password dot length is greater than 0. But the issue there is you set the default here, but then when the password changes you need to set it again. So you then end up setting password box sender. You'd end up having to set it here as well. So we don't want to repeat ourselves. This logic we're going to bake into this has property, has text property. So to do that, this is a class now, so we've got complete access like any other normal class. We're going to just do a public static function because we don't want to access it like this. Just give it the same name, set value. Give it the same parameters, sender, but we're just not going to ask for a value. So we're going to create a second value, a second override for this set value. We're going to remove the logic there. So now when we call set value, you press F12 or you just look, it's going to call this. And then this will then do what we did here. So we copy that first, paste it in here, and then we just remove the value, the logic there. So now we set the value with no parameters, and this can now pass down the sender. And we know the sender is a password box. So we put the logic here. And then this set value, as you can see here, you press F12, it goes to the base class. So it just sets the value of whatever we want, and this is the value. So we've moved the logic of, setting a value to, instead of the caller having to tell you what the reason for that value being a certain thing, we've baked it into the has text property directly. So sets the has text property based on if the caller password box has any text. So we've moved the logic into the right place, and we've effectively repeated the logic of the monitor password from the last example, but now you can see it's a lot more standard looking. To create a has text property, we just override this, and then we didn't even need this. We added this because it was custom logic to set the value easier, and that's it. A nice simple class, no funny looking dependency stuff going on. That's all baked into this base attach property. And then for the monitor password, which is a more complicated example, it's just as easy. We override the value changed, which is just a normal normal method, and then we do our logic in here, and when we want to set values, we just do them by calling the classes. So it just looks a lot more standard. Let's just comment this. So there's a nice way of doing it. So now we've got the monitor password property, the has text property. The only difference now is when we reference them in the XAML, you don't reference this because this isn't an attached property. You simply reference has text property dot, and you don't even need to call them property now. You can just be called has text. You want to now hook into this value property, so, and we've registered it called value. So we go to the text and we change the two places. One was here, password box properties.monitor password becomes now, we're in the normal namespace, so it's just monitor password property. So just get rid of that, and in fact IntelliSense should show up. It's not going to yet. So it's monitor password property.value, I believe. And then here it's going to be has text property dot value, and I think that's all we'll need. Let's try and build. Looks okay, it's running. Let's see if we type, and there we go. So now we've just replaced the whole ugly looking attached properties with a much cleaner way of I just think that just needs reloading. Where's the login page? Yep. Oh, failed to create path. Okay, so I paused on this one and had a quick look fixing that compile issue. It turns out that I think I've discovered a bug in WPF. It seems to be a fairly well-known bug as well, where generics aren't really supported in XAML. So it looks like WPF 4.6 has made a lot of effort to support them. It turned out the issue was in the fact that this style triggers, data binding in style triggers specifically, still doesn't support generic classes. So all I've done, again, the quickness, there's so many ways you can do it. I just remove the text block styles completely. So now we just want to, and I can actually delete these. I was playing with trying to get it to ignore at design time and things. So now the text block in the style, instead of having the style and the triggers, because that's the issue with the binding, we'll simply bind it here as visibility directly to the has text property, and because that's a Boolean, we then simply make a attach property value converter, which is just something I called it for testing. So basically I just made chucked a quick value converter in here to test, that simply then takes in the Boolean and returns a visibility from it. So really it's just a Boolean to visibility converter. So let's just rename that. And let's move that into a class called the same. And then this can be reusable. And then we'll just comment this to state the fact. And there's the class. So that's a value converter we can use, which is simply going to return let's get rid of these unused classes. It's going to return a visibility based on a Boolean property. So now we've just bound it like this. And as you'll see now, the login page is quite happy doing so. And it still works if you run the application. We've renamed this. Boolean to visibility. Compile, still works here. And when you run the application, it still works here. So that's just another way of, again, accomplishing the same task in multiple ways. So one way was to do this styles, which to be honest the new way is a lot simpler than that. Look how messy that style is. All it does is, I guess that sort of bypasses the need for a value converter, but really look how much work's involved there to basically take then, you know, say text of this value and change to this. That's really a value converter right there. So I'd say we start dropping the style triggers, considering they don't seem to be keeping up to date with the support as well. And then the new way we did it was a simple one-liner, so it has property value, and then we just pass in a converter. And that's that. So hopefully this video was useful. We've been over the attached properties, and then we've also created this base attached properties, allowing you to much simpler, or to define much simpler, attached properties just as classes. So yeah, the next video, I'm away for a week now, so the next video will be on at the earliest next Sunday. I'll hopefully try and do it on the Sunday. Thanks.